Good morning, everybody. It's a real honour and a pleasure to be here with you today. My background, I'm an electrical engineer who did a PhD in a thing called innovation theory, which I think gives me the position description of nerd. So until recently, I was actually on the executive of the CSIRO. Pertinent to our conversation today, I also started up a group called CSIRO Futures, which was really looking at what's the next 30 years and how might that play out. And from that came a book called The Sixth Wave, which was really looking at the sixth wave of innovation. And what we found when we started to really dig into the world of innovation is that since the Industrial Revolution, there have been what they call 5 waves of innovation, these long waves. And these waves were very interesting. They lasted for about 30 to 40 years. They started with a lot of disruption. The very first wave was what they call the Industrial Revolution. They coalesced around what they called dominant designs, whether those designs were AC Power or Microsoft Windows. And then they ended with the Global Depression. And since the Industrial Revolution, we've had 5 of these. We've basically had milling, then we moved to steam in the railways, then we moved to electrification, then to mass production was the 4th, and information technology was the 5th. Where we are, we're actually at the cusp, the transition point between the 5th and the 6th wave of innovation. But if it's true, then it creates both a huge amount of challenge, as a lot of companies are seeing, but actually a huge amount of opportunity. It's the companies and the organisations and the people and the countries that plant the seeds early in those waves are the ones that do the best. So our book was really about trying to say, well, maybe we are at the transition between the 5th wave and the 6th, but what could the 6th wave be? And when we looked at all the different candidates for that, and what you do when you're looking for waves of innovation is you look for candidates where you're seeing massive market shifts, massive institutional shifts, and massive technological shifts. Where those 3 things can come together, the place where we see it all happening was around this notion of resource efficiency. You can start to tease out some rules of thumb around how to succeed in the next wave of innovation. The very first one was waste equals opportunity. Waste is nothing more than unsellable production. And not recovering something at the end of a product's life is also a lost opportunity. There's already companies, on the very base level who are going around the world trying to buy up landfills for $1 because they know that eventually the technology will catch up. They'll be able to remediate the landfill, but at the same time they'll do what's called urban mining and basically extracting commodities from waste resources. There's a fascinating woman in the US who's found a technology to basically extract platinum from road dust. For example, all the street sweepers and all the carburetors and other things that actually there's all this valuable stuff in there. Here's a really interesting place where you're just extracting a bit of resource. If we can extract platinum from road dust, we can extract a lot of stuff, from much richer sources. The interesting thing, there's a whole lot of technology starting to come online, the bioleaching space, for example. So it's just in its infancy, but basically little microbes that will extract copper, extract some more resources, and if you just get the environments right. Green chemistry, for example, that notion that, why are we doing one-way chemical reactions? That's nature doesn't do it that way. Everything nature does is a 2-way chemical reaction. It can be reversed some way. So these technologies are coming online. People are finding new ways, and in fact there's this massive move at the moment that we're seeing to start to secure some of those waste streams. A final little example is the guy who's going around trying to get an option on sewers, right? Just because one day all those phosphates are going to be worth something, particularly since we think we're going to hit peak phosphate in 2020. Technology trends are there, the market trends are there, and now the institutional factors are starting to come online as well to basically link those two up. China is an interesting tipping point in a lot of this. I was speaking at the World Resources Forum last year, and a lot of the comments there was actually about how China is trying to secure most of the major resource streams because it realises that its growth is intrinsically linked to 2 things. One is how much resource they can consume, but interestingly, there is this realisation that ultimately there needs to be a decoupling of economic growth from resource consumption. If you really get to the heart of the 6th wave, that's what we're talking about. It's the decoupling of economic growth from resource consumption. It's finding the ways to get more value with the same resource or the same value with less resource. And as we do that, it basically just makes, economic sense when we start to go down that path. The other thing I sort of thought I'd throw into the mix here is that notion of the circular economy. Somehow where we're finding, everything in its own world is being recycled or coming back and fitting in a circle. But if you really dig into it, there's 2 types of things we do as humans. We either consume stuff or we use stuff. There's the things we consume, like water or food or whatever, and there's the things we use, right, as clever monkeys who've got really cool tools like our phone or our computer or the seats you're sitting on or whatever. And the interesting thing is when you really start to think of the circular economy in terms of those 2, you realise that there's 2 futures for for a lot of the stuff. For the things we consume, the pathway is going to be recycle as much as you possibly can. For the things we use, the interesting pathway is going to be shifted all to services as much as you can. You don't own that chair, you're getting the service of that chair at the moment. Right? Ultimately, the value in a phone or a piece of technology is actually the services it provides, not the thing itself. And the challenge has been that those two things, the things we use and the things we consume, have actually bleeded or sort of moved into each other a bit too much, where we're consuming a lot of stuff, but throwing it away. And I think what's going to start to happen in countries around the world, Australia, others, we're going to start to separate those two circles. The things we use, we'll try to make them, we'll sell them probably as services that last longer. The bits that we actually have to consume, because they do degrade, we'll try to recover and put them in terms of the circular economy from a recycling point of view. But when you pull those two things apart, you realise that, yeah, there is a future. It is actually possible to do this stuff. It's about recycling on one side and selling services on the other. The marketplace we're trying to create with TuShare, the company we're forming, is actually, it's a giving marketplace. We chose that for two reasons. One is we realised that what we're trying to do is beat the bin. Why do things not see their full lifespan, right, in people's homes? It's because they fit into one of four categories generally. They're either life stage items, so you grow out of it, or they're media, so like books or CD or computer games or whatever. You've consumed it, you're not going to, unless it's a really great book, you're not going to read that thing again. The third is it's an upgradable, a phone or sporting equipment or kitchenware. Or the fourth is that it's fashion. We've done some back-of-the-envelope calculations. It's very hard to find these numbers. There's about 100 billion of those things sold every year in those categories, which are destined, because of their nature, to probably not see their full lifespan with the first owner. What we realise is the actual thing you've got to beat is the bin. So how do you make it really easy? Right? Well, giving is actually easier than selling. Particularly when you're talking about giving to friends, if you can match the demand side, particularly with the supply side, if you can pick up from one person's house to put it to the other, if you can not have to negotiate if it's first in, best dressed, all those sorts of things, much easier than selling. But the second one, which is really interesting and why a giving market, is because it creates a much more interesting sort of gratitude, generosity cycle. One of our users, talked to me about it. She put batteries in the thing before she sent it because she wanted to make sure it was working for the person. She knew that, that the person that was going to have it. And the other person was very grateful and took a photo of their son using it, which makes the other person more generous. When we look at innovation, the first thing you do is you start to look at the megatrends over the top of all of that. And I think the megatrends I talked about earlier, which is around resource scarcity, all these areas are basically writ large in where we're going over the next 30 years. So I think there's some of the things, the notion that it will be cheaper ultimately to dig it out of the ground than try to find it from a resource that's already been dug out of the ground. I think ultimately the recovery option will probably become more efficient than the non-recovery option. So that interplay between markets, technology and institutions, when the profit motive is a strong one, it's not the only one. And there is a whole lot of institutional mechanisms in particular, whether they're legal mechanisms or even behavioural things, which can actually influence behaviour just as much. Last year was the first year when car ownership in America actually hit a peak, went back down. What's the reason for that? It's not because cars got more expensive. It's actually because people decided they didn't want to waste their time driving a car. And there's lots of other things you could be doing when you're sitting on a bus now. You can be using your time more efficiently. And so that was a completely different motive that we're starting to see online around this issue. The more profit motives you can find, the more institutional mechanisms you can get to line up that pathway from the technologies you need to the marketplace, the better. But there's actually all these other levers that can be potentially pulled as well, and some of them are quite effective. I talked about decoupling economic growth from resource consumption. That, I think, is one of the things we saw as the journey for the next 30 years for the economy, for the world. We've done it once before. We decoupled economic growth from labour in the Industrial Revolution. In the Industrial Revolution, if you wanted more tables, you needed more people to make more tables. Then we came up with a way of decoupling that so we could have more tables for the same number of people, or one table for less people. Before then, the whole story of the world was those two things are tightly coupled, then bang, we decoupled them. So for me, the story that we're talking about now is actually the next bit. Economic growth for the last 200 years has been coupled to resource consumption, right? We're just going to split those two things again. So for me, the vision for e-waste is actually basically the things you need, or the things you want, the electronics you want, without consuming any resource.